For more, let's speak now with Paul Haenle, a director of Carnegie China and chairman of Asia Pacific Haenle. He joins us from Singapore, and Ivy Kwek, who is a fellow for China at the International Crisis Group. She joins us from Taipei this morning. So, Paul, let me start with you first. How did the visit of U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan change the status quo in the U.S., China, Taiwan dynamic? And how do you see it developing next year?
Well, thanks, Julie, for having me on, and thanks for the question. I think that the visit by Nancy Pelosi, let's put it this way, the Chinese did not let a good crisis go to waste. They were able to capitalize on Pelosi's visit from a military standpoint. Your summary alluded to that. China conducted its first live-fire joint force exercises to date. They had ballistic missile launches, multiple waves of aircraft sorties into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, across the Taiwan center line, and they declared these 6 military exclusion zones surrounding Taiwan. Some of the ballistic missile launches landed in Japan's EEZ, and one of the military exclusion zones was actually only 10 miles from the Philippines. So you can see this is a security challenge, not just for Taiwan, but could draw in other regional countries as well. The exercises were important in that they gave the PLA valuable practice in terms of joint force capabilities. The second point, I think, is that the Chinese used the visit to increase its patrols around Taiwan. Now they have a more continuous and persistent presence around Taiwan, which gives their PLA, their Chinese military, some advantages. It can help to sort of wear down Taiwan operational capabilities, puts pressure on Taiwan, and it can, they can expand and contract this pressure without now eliciting as much of a response from the U.S. and other regional actors. And so, for example, the median line, the center line, for 2 decades, crossing that center line was rare. Today, it's become fairly routine. And just last week, we saw China send in 18 nuclear-capable bomber aircraft into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. So this constitutes a sort of a new normal, and it gives the PLA a stronger and more advantageous position, which they now have after Pelosi's visit.
And Ivy, Pelosi's visit was always going to draw a reaction from China. Did the scale of the response, as Paul has laid out, surprise you?
Yes, the tensions across Taiwan Strait have definitely elevated a lot this year because of the exercise that we saw in August. Some might have even called it the 4th Taiwan Straits. And since then, we actually observe several new patterns in the military activities across Taiwan Straits. So first of all, China has sustained the gray zone activities by sending PLA planes into Taiwan ADIZ, as well as PLA vessels into surrounding waters. Even though the numbers have reduced from the peak in August, it is actually still more frequent compared to a pre-August level. Just for context, there were 874 PLA planes detected in Taiwan's ADIZ in August. The number has come down to 463 in November, but this is still very significant considering that in July and the month before, the number is around 70 to 100. And the second new pattern is that China has now normalized the crossing of the median line. And even though this median line has no legal standing in international law, it has been a tacit understanding between the two sides that also serve as a confidence-building measure. By crossing the median line, this actually brings the PLA planes much closer to the ROC planes, which reduce the response time of ROC Air Force, and in turn increases the risk of escalation and untoward incidents between the two militaries. This situation is even more precarious if we consider that there is currently no crisis management mechanism between the mainland and Taiwan, which might lead to a high chance of miscalculation of each other's intention.
So, Paul, you touched on what China has gained from Pelosi's visit. So in hindsight, was Pelosi's visit to Taiwan worth it from the U.S. point of view, or has it inflicted more damage compared to any sort of geopolitical gains?
Well, I think what you're referring to is the argument that many were making, which was, a Speaker of the House had visited Taiwan 25 years previously. Newt Gingrich, when he was Speaker of the House, had visited Taiwan. So this was not breaking some sort of precedent. But many people ask the question: is Taiwan better off after Pelosi's visit? Are the Taiwan people safer? And I think that's a legitimate question to ask. And you also have to keep in mind that Nancy Pelosi's visit took place in August, just prior to the very intense and important 20th Party Congress in China. And as I said, the Chinese military was standing by to take advantage of the tensions as they rose and to respond to the crisis in a way that now has given it a pretty significant military advantage in the context of what they call sort of salami slicing, where each event and the response that China undertakes gives it a degree of advantage, and it will continue to do that. And I suspect if the new Speaker of the House in 2023, whether that's Kevin McCarthy or someone else from the Republican side, decides to visit the island of Taiwan, which looks like it probably will happen, I suspect that the PLA is prepared to do something very similar as well.
And Paul, remind us why the US is so determined to make Taiwan an issue. Is it as much about ideology as it is about the semiconductor industry?
Well, I think it has less to do with the semiconductor industry. You have to remember, Steve, this is an issue that has been an area of disagreement since the U.S. and China normalized relations in the 1970s. And there is the one China principle in Beijing, which says that Taipei and Beijing are part of the same China, and that China is ruled and determined by Beijing. The U.S. one China policy is that there is a dispute, acknowledges that the two are part of the same China, but does not give the current Chinese Communist Party, does not agree that is it. What it wants is a peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue. And that is really the one kind of red line that the Americans have been very clear about. And that's why you see such concern now, because as Ivy has described, as your summary described, the military aggression and the military coercion and activity that the PLA is conducting around Taiwan is really intensifying. And it's been intensifying for the last several years. Ivy mentioned gray zone tactics. And that's of considerable concern to the United States. The United States also has a law called the Taiwan Relations Act, which obligates the United States to help Taiwan in its defense. And I think all of this, and my last point would be, all of this, a big spotlight was put on the Taiwan question in the aftermath of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. And less than 3 weeks before that, the Chinese leadership signed a no-limits strategic partnership with Russia. And the Chinese don't like it, but this has put an international spotlight on the question of Taiwan. And could military aggression be used there? And I think the U.S. and other regional actors will try to do what they can proactively to try to prevent such an outcome.
Right. So, Ivy, let me pose this question to you. Many observers have suggested that President Xi may adopt aggressive options, once the military completes its preparations by 2027. Do you believe by then that China will have the capacity to successfully invade Taiwan if it wants? And in turn, will the U.S. be ready to respond in 5 years?
Well, President Xi has described Taiwan as the core interests of China. And so we should not dismiss China's resolve on Taiwan. Having said that, I don't think that China intends to launch a full-scale invasion on Taiwan in the near future. It is true that in the 20th Party Congress, China has stated that the PLA should quickly advance its goals to be a world-class military by 2049. And there are some interim objectives set for 2027. But at the moment, we know that we think that China has have not developed fully the capability to guarantee a sure victory if it chooses to launch a military option on Taiwan, because this is a major undertaking that has a high cost and also a lot of uncertainties and also great risk, especially given that the kind of attention that Taiwan is enjoying from the international community right now. So for China, I believe that they have not, even though they have not renounced the military option, they have not also given up the peaceful unification option. And we also see that apart from military efforts, China is also undertaking a lot of non-military efforts, including some of the economic coercion, import bans on Taiwanese goods, as well as the strengthening of interactions with some of the parties and actors in Taiwan that are considered China-friendly. With regards to the US, I think that Paul has also alluded to some of the preparation done on the US part. And I think that if we see some of the increasing frequencies of the joint exercises that the US is doing with its ally in the region, it is clear that US and its allies taking the Chinese threat very seriously, and is also at the same time strengthening deterrence against a potential conflict over Taiwan.
All right, thank you so much for your time and expertise. Paul Haenle, Director of Carnegie China and Chairman, Asia Pacific, Teneo, and Ivy Kwek, a Fellow of China with the International Crisis Group.